Good morning and happy Mother's Day. And we're going to be talking about honoring mothers as well as honoring fathers. And this fifth commandment, if you take your Bibles and open up to Deuteronomy chapter 5, we're going to be looking at verse 16 of chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. A couple of things you probably need to know in order to make more sense out of this and the application of it. First of all, this commandment focuses on all authority structures, not just parents. I know it says mother and father, but there's a sense in which the mother and father is extended out into like fathers of our nation and mothers who care for our souls and those kind of things. Almost all of the early church fathers and almost all of the reformers will agree that this commandment is far more extensive than just parents. Martin Luther wrote extensively on how this involves anybody in a seat of authority. You also need to know that the word honor means to give weight to. If you're in the 60s, you go, heavy. It means you take it significantly, that when it's said and when you hear it, it weighs on you. It's not something you treat lightly. Something you give weight to, not necessarily that you obey it. I know it says it in Ephesians chapter 6, children, obey your parents in the Lord. As much as they are in the Lord, you're to follow them. Giving room for you, if you have parents who are telling you to do something who are not in the Lord, who may be Christians even, and at that particular time are telling you something that is not in the Lord, you take that seriously, what they're telling you, but you still have room to not obey them because you're obeying God, which is your ultimate authority. That also comes into play in the authority structures and in our honoring those in authority over us. But if you're going to disobey the governing authorities, do so with great caution and great heaviness, knowing that you better be right. Or otherwise, you're disobeying God and you're disobeying God. The last thing is that, and that goes along with it, the honor means to just give significance to. It doesn't always mean that we have to obey. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and have, I forgot who's reading this text. David's going to come up and read from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. And I'm not sure we're going to use a reader next week because it's only 2 words in the Hebrew, 4 words in the English. So next week, be prepared for me to give their text. But listen to David as he reads this text for us today.
Please stand. Deuteronomy 5:16. Honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and that it may go well with you in the land of the Lord your God has given you.
This is God's word. You may be seated. Hopefully you heard in that reading a promise that it will go well with you and you can live long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. This is the only commandment that we have so far that gives a promise to us in obeying it. So, the question before the house, if you'd like to follow along in the sermon outline, you should have received one in your sermon service folder as you entered in. The question before the house today is this. What is God's will for us in observing the fifth commandment? What kind of things should we be thinking about? What kind of things should we take heavily and not lightly? I believe the answer is this. God wants us to understand that we honor Him when we honor any authority God has established. This comes very, very clear to us in Romans chapter 13. We'll be referring to that quite often. In fact, I really flirted with using that as the auxiliary text. And I probably should have used it as a third auxiliary text, but I really wanted you to hear the Genesis story because from very, very early on, we get this indication of how we honor our parents with Shem and Ham and Japheth and their father being drunk. I don't know if you picked up on it, but one of them basically come out and said, "Hey guys, you'll never believe what Dad did. Come and see." And the other two go, "No, this is dishonoring to our father. We need to treat them with more respect than that." And they went in backwards to make sure that they didn't see their father's nakedness. So God wants us to understand that we honor Him when we honor any authority God has established. The first and most fundamental authority we need to honor is our parents. It begins very early on when you're first becoming cognizant as a human being that you need to honor your parents for a lot of reasons. And I hope to be able to explain those reasons for us today. The authority structures that honoring those in authority is referring to, authority means to have the right to impose obligation. Your parents have the right to obligate you to certain things. If you're not a parent, I know how hard this is for you to hear. If you are a parent, you're going, yes, preacher, Pastor Keith. Yeah, go, man, go. But we've all been in line at Walmart and watch a little 5-year-old who has not yet learned any discipline, who wants the Snickers bar, and the mom does not want to buy the kid the Snickers bar. And the mother just is sitting there in humiliation. And you want to discipline the child, but it's not yours. Listen, life will go much better for that 5-year-old. Life will go much better for Walmart. And life will go much better for everybody in line if that child will learn to honor his father and mother. The commandments were given to us as a culture, were given to us as a society, given to us as a community in order to make all y'all better, not just you as an individual. And unfortunately, we take the commands of God and we sometimes think, well, I don't need to follow that because this is better for me right now. And it tears down the whole system when we do what's better for me right now. Because when we begin to dishonor those in authority, the whole culture crumbles a little bit. It dismantles it. And that's what the God of the universe understands about a culture. That's what the God of the universe understands about our individual hearts. And we're looking for any possible excuse not to have to follow the governing authorities, not to have to give honor to the governing authorities. And the God of the universe will not let you out of that. He wants you to honor all authority structures, especially parents, and it begins at home. Mothers, I know that disciplining your child is hard. Fathers, I know that disciplining your child is hard. But listen, if it wasn't going to be hard, God would have never began childhood and motherhood by something called labor. So we should have known real early on this was going to be a tough go. Please understand it's hard, but it's best. And you'll enjoy your children, and children, you will enjoy your parents, and life will truly go better for you, and life will allow you to live longer and better on the face of the planet if you'll do what God has commanded us to do. Unfortunately, since the 60s, we've divorced authority and love and think that they're mutually exclusive categories. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need to reestablish the connection between authority and love, and that God chose to disperse love to us through authority structures. We unfortunately have love being this warm and fuzzy kind of, I feel good, and all this kind of thing, and thinking that's what love is. It's not. Love is being willing to sacrifice for the benefit of others. And that doesn't necessarily mean warm fuzzies. In fact, most of the time, it's not warm fuzzies. It's a sacrifice. It's pain. It's coming and dying, like what we sang. So, what are the implications of observing the fifth commandment? 1, parents are, as well as all authorities, are established by God. Romans 13:1. And if you would ever doubt what I have to say, please consult Romans 13 because it's absolutely better at explaining the concept that I'm going to promote, and I'm already regretting not using that as auxiliary text because I'm going to refer to it a lot. Parents, as well as all authorities, are established by God. Romans 13:1, the Apostle Paul says this: everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Parents, governors, presidents, secretary of states, police officers, employers, teachers, they're all established by God. But you're saying, but there's some really evil ones. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now let's talk about it now. Look at the scriptures. God is saying, obey the governing authorities, obey your father and mother that you may go well with you and live long. Look at the scriptures. Joseph, Genesis chapters 37 through 50. Joseph was sold into slavery. His brothers that were older than him were mean to him. Potiphar was unreasonable with him. He's put into prison. He keeps honoring the governing authorities, the prison keeper. He keeps honoring the governing authorities, the jail keeper. He keeps honoring them because he knows they're established by God. And what does God do with him? Catapults him up to second in command of all of Egypt. Daniel. He's just sitting in Jerusalem trying to figure out what has happened with his nation because it's crumbling fast because they've disobeyed God and the governing authorities, and it's not going well with them, and they're not going to live long in the land. And he's taken off into captivity into Babylon, where the people are asking him to do all sorts of unrighteous things. Babylon is not the epitome of righteousness. By anybody's standards, they were ungodly. But Daniel submits to them as far as his conscience will allow him to. And in the places where his conscience will not allow him to submit to the governing authorities, he appeals respectfully and honorably to those governing authorities and says, will you please allow me to eat these foods because my faith in God will not allow me to eat these foods. If you'll just give me a chance to prove myself, I'm sure that God will prove to be faithful. And they go, wow, he's right. Hey, king, we need to have people eating what Daniel has to say. Over and over again, Daniel submits to the governing authority. What happens to Daniel? He's second in command at all of Babylon. 127 different states that Daniel's in charge of. Jesus. We'll talk about him in the gospel application. The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul writes extensively about submitting to governing authorities. You know what those governing authorities are going to do with the Apostle Paul? They're going to execute him. The Apostle Paul, saw the bigger picture rather than his own welfare and benefit. He understood that submitting to the governing authorities was better for all y'all, rather than just him. And we need to get off our high horse that the world revolves around us. And if it's not best for me, it's not best. No! You all, maybe you're familiar with the verse in Jeremiah chapter 29. I know the plans that I have for you, plans to do good and not evil. Jeremiah 29:13. Okay, 10 of you. Okay, good. We've got some raised hands. Thank you so much for sharing. Do you know what's in context of that particular chapter? When God says, I know the plans that I have for you, plans to do good and not evil, he's writing to the people that are in exile in Babylon that have been taken there by a godless nation because they've been disobedient to God, and they're living in Babylon for the next 70 years, and God tells them, you obey and submit to the governing authorities, because if there's peace in Babylon, you'll enjoy that life in Babylon a lot better than living in conflict and disruption the whole time. The better Babylon gets along, the better you're going to be getting along because you're living in Babylon. Now, God is not telling them to disobey God's commands, but God is telling them as far as you can go to submit and honor Babylon, you need to do it. Because if Babylon succeeds, you succeed. If there's peace in Babylon, there's peace in your life. If there's security and stability in Babylon, there's security and stability in your life. This is good preaching, Pastor Keith. Well, thank you very much. I'm really trying hard, but sometimes it's really, really hard. And sometimes we struggle and suffer, and those that are in authority over us have no clue how much we're struggling because they're concerned about other things. There was 3 mothers one time that were talking to each other about how wonderful their sons were. And the one mother said, my son took me out to Severino's here in Hillsdale, and he allowed me to invite 50 of my friends to it's not Severino's anymore, it's Johnny T's. Boy, have I got to catch up with the 1960s. Sorry. My son let me invite 50 other people, my friends, to Johnny T's, and he paid for the whole thing. And the second mother said, that's nothing. My son allowed me to take 10 of my friends on a Caribbean cruise for 3 weeks in the Caribbean. All of my friends could come along with it. He paid for the whole thing. And the third mother went, that's nothing at all. My son meets 3 times a week with a psychiatrist and pays $150 and talks nothing about me. Sometimes the authority structures are clueless as far as how much grief and pain that they're giving us, but that does not excuse us from not honoring them. Do you know that the church can be a real source of pain for you? Way too many people went. Folks, I understand this. We're human. We make mistakes. I am not your Messiah. The church board is not your Messiah. We're doing our best. And I really believe that the God of the universe has every governing authority with warts and all in order for us to never, never forget that our security and stability does not rest on people here on earth. It rests in Jesus, in God. In God we trust. And if you ever forget that, just look at your money. Weird place to have it. Listen, this is not something new that's just happened recently. 1,600 years ago, St. Augustine, not the city, but the saint, St. Augustine said, the church is a prostitute, the church is a whore, but she's my mother. He understood, and we need to understand, that just because those in authority above us are not perfect, that does not give us an excuse for not submitting and honoring them. I know I have warts. I know that our church board have warts. I know we're imperfect. But folks, Hebrews 13:17 is really true. If you dishonor and make life hard for me, you're making life hard for yourself. Boy, does our nation need to understand that about our government officials. Well, let's go on. I've spent way too much time on that point. What are the implications of observing the second commandment? Number 2, we honor God when we honor authorities. Romans chapter 13, verse 2. He who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. We need to understand that if we're willing to stretch, if we're willing to even suffer and die under the governing authorities because we're trying to honor them the best that we can, at the same time honoring God, which, by the way, is why Jesus went to the cross and the Apostle Paul went to the executioners and Peter was hung upside down on a cross. All 3 were submitting to the governing authorities and doing so in obedience to God. But even if we have to suffer in doing that, God is exalted and honored, and he will honor us. But how can God honor us if we're dead? Oh, let me tell you. Because there's so much more beyond this world. So much more beyond this life. If you're living for this life only, the Apostle Paul's exactly right. You're of all men most to be pitied. Because this life is not worth sacrificing for. If this is all there is. The writer of Ecclesiastes is right. Vanity, vanity, it's all vanity. But folks, there's so much more. And that's why we're willing to suffer and even die like the Apostle Paul did, like Peter did, like Jesus did, submitting to the governing authorities because we know that there's so much more. Did you hear about the crazy daughter during Mother's Day? There was a pile of dishes in the sink, and the mother was getting ready to go wash the dishes. And the daughter said, nobly, "Oh, mother, you shouldn't be washing dishes on Mother's Day. You can get to them tomorrow." What's wrong with that picture? Don't honor mothers only on Mother's Day. We need to honor mothers every day. We need to honor fathers every day. We need to honor the governing authorities every day. 3, what are the implications of observing the 5th commandment? To honor authority means to respect, submit to, provide for, and have an interest in their legacy. We should do all that we can to hold their name in high regard and perpetuate as much as we can their name in high regard. Let me read some scriptures for you. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3. Each of you must respect his father and mother, and you must observe my Sabbath. I find it interesting that the God of the universe connects respect for father and mother with Sabbath. Why? Because they're all the same. If you've done it to them, you've done it for me. There's an interesting connection throughout the scriptures that we're not just treating our neighbor as a neighbor, we treat them. We're treating our neighbor because we're treating God the same way. That's why the Apostle Paul says what he does in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I believe, and Ephesians chapter 5. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Because when you love her, you're loving him. When you honor her, you honor him. As you've done it to the least of these, my brothers, you've done it for me. To honor authority means to respect, submit to, provide for, have an interest in their legacy. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 16. Cursed is the man who dishonors his father and mother. If you don't believe that, just talk to Noah's son who made fun of his father when he was drunk. I love this one. This is so graphic. You're going to love it. Those of you who like, well, never mind. I'll let you figure out who you are. Proverbs 30, verse 17. The eye that mocks a father, that scorns obedience to a mother, will be pecked out by the ravens of the valley, will be eaten by the vultures. Ah! Ah! Do I have to explain that verse? 1 Timothy 5:8. If anyone does not provide for his relatives and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Can we talk? Our culture is horrible about honoring our elders. If you don't believe me, I double dog dare you to make a trip to the nursing home, any of the Drew's places or the Hillsdale County Medical Care Facility, and take inventory of the number of people that have never been visited by their family. Never. That's horrendous. And if you're guilty of that, and you're saying, well, you're stepping on my toes, can I just suggest that I'm going to push harder? They cleaned up your bottom when you were little. Why can't you extend the same courtesy to them when they're incapacitated? But they drool. You drooled. They don't know what they're doing. You didn't know what you were doing for a long time. But they can't eat themselves and they can't clean up after potty themselves. So what? This is a big problem in 21st century America. If you don't believe it, talk to an employee of the nursing homes. happens way too often, and I can tell by some of your faces, guilt is written all over your forehead. It'll come off with a wash. This is good preaching, as hard as it may be. It's good preaching because, folks, let me tell you a story. There's a Chinese man whose father was getting very, very old and eating a lot of rice, but he was not productive. He wasn't able to do anything. He wasn't able to be mobile, and so he was really just consuming a lot of time and a lot of resources in the family. So the father finally decided to take his father off someplace in a wheelbarrow and just dumping. And the grandson, the son's boy, wanted to go along with him. He said, yeah, you can go with me. And so they loaded up Grandpa in a wheelbarrow, and they started up the mountain. And as they were going up the mountain, the grandson asked the son, what are we doing with Grandpa? Why are we taking him up the mountain? And so while they were going, the father explained to his son, well, Grandpa's not able to do much anymore, and he eats a lot of rice, and he really has a lot of problem to take care of. We're going to take him up in the mountains and just let him live there on his own and take care of himself for the rest of his life. And the grandson said, well, what will happen then? Well, he'll eventually die, and that'll be the end of his life. And the grandson said, wow, Dad, I'm really glad that you allowed me to go along with you because now I know what to do with you. Some of you are not laughing. You do know that one day your children will be in charge of your welfare. What have you taught them? And we'll get to that later on. Number 4, what are the implications of observing the 5th commandment? God honors us when we honor him. That's why Joseph, Daniel, and Apostle Paul all just flipped my trigger about how God chooses to honor us and how life is better for us if we honor God. Do you know there's one time a rabbi that was taking his grandchildren on a trip, and he was sitting in the airplane next to an atheist. And the atheist kept watching the rabbi's grandchildren coming up to him and just honoring him by saying, Grandpa, is there anything you need? We'd be glad to help you out with this. And Grandpa, do you want us to get this for you? And the atheist sat there and just was amazed at how his grandchildren were just falling over themselves to try to take care of him. And the atheist looked over to the rabbi and said, the respect that your children and grandchildren show you is wonderful. Mine don't show me that kind of respect. Here's what the rabbi said. Think about it. To my children and grandchildren, I am one step closer in a chain of tradition to the time when God spoke to the whole Jewish people on Mount Sinai. To your children and grandchildren, you are one step closer to being an ape. Who are they going to honor? If you're just some result of cosmic goo, some evolutionary process, and we're getting better and better, then folks, you're old hat. You're has been. They're better and more improved and newer. The God of the universe, in fact, I really think, folks, the truth be known, we're getting worse off. We're devolving, not evolving. I look at the people in the past and all that they were able to accomplish without a word processor, without electricity. Can you imagine what Martin Luther could have done with a word processor? He already has 50-some volumes of Luther's works. It's just massive. What about Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo with a CAD system? Some of you have no idea what that is. Talk to an architect or a designer and they'll let you know. And we think we're superior? We can't even add and subtract anymore without some device telling us what to do. That's another story. but I'll preach on it one day. You can count on it. Conclusion. From where does instruction and example come for children to know how to honor their parents? It comes from parents. It comes from them watching you. How do you respond to your parents? Do you honor them? Do you treat them seriously? Do you give them weight and significance? I'll never forget one day, I was sitting in the parlor. My wife and I heard about the parlor when we were in Florida at seminary. The parlor is in Jackson, this ice cream store, Loud's it used to be called. Used to be you could get more than enough ice cream for 5 people for $5. But now it's gotten more expensive, and that's another story. We went to Loud's. My wife and I were sitting in a little booth, and right next to us came in a whole family, and they were coming in. They all ordered really nice sundaes and everything else, and the family of 4 was eating them. And the parents would say, "Oh, honey, don't you need to go to the bathroom?" Wink, wink, and the one kid would go. And then they'd say about 2 minutes later, "Don't you need to go to the bathroom?" Wink, wink, and then they would go. And then the parents finally said, "Well, we need to go to the bathroom too." And they all got up and left. And after about 10 minutes, I realized, they've never come back. They had stiffed the waitress. They had stiffed Loud's the parlor of their whole bill, ate all that ice cream, and never paid a penny for it. Folks, it's one thing to steal. It's another thing to implicate your children. What have they learned? Your children pick up a lot from you. If you knew my parents, you go, "Well, no wonder. That's why Pastor Keith's the way he is." Especially if you knew my mother. You won't be able to know her until you go to heaven. One time, a husband and wife were painting their bedroom. And the 5-year-old came in, "What the blankety blank are you doing in here?" And then left. And the father turned to his wife and said, "Where the blankety blank did she learn that?" If you're upset with your children, bing, chances are great they learned that trait from you. You need to discipline your children. You need to teach them to honor authority structures, and they learn how to honor governing authorities by watching you honor governing authorities. I'm appalled at how school teachers are left hung out to dry anymore because administration won't protect them and parents don't want to protect them. You couldn't pay me enough money to be a school teacher. I'm sorry, Lacey, but don't tell your dad that I said that. My son-in-law is a school teacher, and I don't know how he survives. For those of you who are school teachers, you need to really understand how to operate your life in a very, very delicate balance. And you are extremely blessed if you have an administration that will back you up. Because I can tell you firsthand, there are administrations that if you get in a conflict with a parent, you're hung out to dry. They won't support you at all. I know when I got in trouble at school, I was on my own. Because my parents, my teachers, they had to be spending the whole night collaborating their story against me. Honor the authority structures. Worship point. Worship the God who loves us and wants us all to enjoy the best possible life here on a fallen planet. That can only happen when we have a proper regard for authority. Wow. The God of the universe knows that you're never going to be able to prosper, never going to be able to enjoy the security and prosperity that you want to enjoy unless you all enjoy it together. I don't know if you thought about what would happen if the culture crumbled completely. I've thought about it a lot because in the 1980s, I did a lot of research on the end times, eschatology, and what was going to happen according to the scriptures when the last hurrah happens on planet Earth. And I've schemed hundreds of times, what can I invest in? What can I put my trust in order to try to survive? Do I invest in gold or silver or money or land or those? No, don't raise your hand. You know what? It's all not going to work. No matter what you try to survive with, whatever you try to invest in order to survive the onslaught, if culture collapses, it's not going to work because, folks, if everybody's starving and you got a food hoard, they're going to pick up on that. Guess where they're going to come the next night? Hey, we want some of your food. No. Hell, we'll take it. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. You may find out firsthand. Folks, trust in the Lord. And the bottom line, what the God of the universe is telling us is, we need to support the entire culture. We need to support all the governing authorities to keep it all intact. Because if it goes to hell in a handbasket, if it comes unglued, it'll be the book of Judges all over again. And that's not a pretty book. That's why the Ten Commandments are written for the entire community, for the entire culture, for the entire society, for the entire nation. We need stability and security, but it only comes when we support each other and build each other up, and not by undermining the governing authorities, by making fun of them all the time and protesting all the time. There's a righteous, honoring way to do it, and we've lost it. Well, let's go on. Gospel application. Only Jesus perfectly fulfilled the comprehensive implications of the fifth commandment. Look to Jesus to have credited to your account what you are never going to be able to accomplish. Folks, if you think you have a righteous way of not honoring the governing authorities, I just double dog dare you to look at the life of Jesus. He created the entire universe. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and yet he voluntarily submitted himself to his mother and father. Teaching in the temple at age 12, he's amazing all the rest of the rabbis. His mother and father find out he's not part of the clan going back to Nazareth. They come back to Jerusalem and go, son, what are you doing here? Mom and Dad, don't you know that I need to be about my father's business? And it says that he left and went back to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. Why? Because he was honoring the governing authorities, even though he was far superior to them. He's standing before Pilate. Pilate says, behold the man. Pilate says, Jesus, you unnerve me. Don't you understand that I have the power to let you go or to kill you? And Jesus says to Pilate, you would have no authority over me if it wasn't given to you by my Father. Which made Pilate very nervous. Pilate then, with an act of true justice and honorable conduct, has Jesus crucified, even though he knows he's innocent. What does Jesus say about that in protest? Not a word. We need to understand that the God of the universe, himself incarnate, submits to governing authorities at the cost of his life because he knows that's what God wants him to do. Apostle Paul, same thing. Apostle Peter, same thing. They both encourage us to follow the governing authorities. They both lost their lives to the governing authorities because they knew that life on this earth, and they knew that honoring the authorities was bigger than just their life. But we're so self-centered and we're so self-consumed, we don't see that. Spiritual challenge. See every authority as having been established by God, but a proper conformity to the fifth commandment can only begin when we have a properly observed commandments 1 through 4. We need to first worship God, worship him only, not make any other image, and honor the Sabbath day, and realize that we don't take his name in vain first before we ever begin to properly honor authorities. So what? We will never enjoy the security, stability, encouragement, and prosperity God desires for us to have unless or until we honor authorities. I want to tell you real quick 2 stories. The first is about a guy that lived on the 3rd floor of our apartment complex where I had my music store in Huntington, Indiana. My music store is on the 1st floor. Gene and I and our family lived on the 2nd floor. And this guy and his dog lived on the 3rd floor. He asked if his dog could live with us, and I knew that his dog was not going to be a problem because the guy had his dog absolutely, totally under control. I never saw a dog as obedient as his name was Jerry, as Jerry's dog. I mean, the dog would sit there at perfect attention with his head leaned against his thigh, and Jerry would say to the dog, sit, boom, and I mean, he was down instantly. And the say, roll over, and he's back up. I mean, it was stunning how obedient this dog was. And I said, Jerry, how did you get your dog to be this obedient? And I knew that Jerry was taking dog obedience classes. He said something very, very instructive to me. Jerry said, my instructor told me when we first started classes in dog obedience that you have to have your dog be totally obedient to you, not only for your sake and for your benefit, but for the dog's sake and benefit. Because the dog wants to be with you and wants to enjoy the life with you, but you'll never feel comfortable and secure in taking the dog to a lot of places unless you know you can trust the dog to be obedient. The last thing you want to do is take the dog to the park and take after some 3-year-old and terrorize somebody. Last thing you want to do is take the dog to down the street and have it cross the street and get run over. And so Jerry took this to heart seriously, and he had this dog in perfect obedience. And guess what? He took the dog everywhere. It was always in the path. Jerry was a single eligible bachelor. What is he, about 32, 34, somewhere in there. But his dog was always in the passenger, never a woman, but always a dog in the passenger seat. That dog went with him everywhere. Switch gears for just a second, but not really. You ever gone on an airplane and watch a 4-year-old that's sitting by a parent and just coloring rice? 3 hours on a flight and just never, you don't even know they're there. And you just, mother, you've done a wonderful job with your child. And then the other 4-year-old on the flight. The stewardess says, Mother, you need to get your child restrained. We can't take off until they're buckled in. But I'm trying to get him. You do it. You know what happens when they drag people? Well, you understand? The mother finally gets the child corralled, and the child's still wrestling around and fighting. And finally, after they get up in the air and she lets go of the child, and the stewardess asks the child if he wants to play outside, the mother's in her seat whimpering and crying because it's an absolute terror to go on an airplane flight with this child. Which of those 2 children is going to take a lot of trips? Which of those 2 children is going to have fun at the zoo? Which of those 2 children can be trusted to ride a go-kart at an early age? This is not rocket science. Some of you are looking at it like this is a trick question, right? No. I'm trying to get us to realize that our Father in heaven does not allow us to enjoy certain experiences that we want to enjoy because we can't be trusted. Let's pray.